Hello, everyone. This is the Kerry&Liam podcast. I am your host, Liam. Kerry will not be able to join us for the first few episodes as she's quite busy right now with our newborn son, James. And as a matter of fact, if you hear him in the background, he's taking a nap on me. So please bear with us. But in this episode today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite websites called Low Tech Magazine. It is a very interesting website with lots of eye-opening articles and interesting ideas. A lot of the environmentalist movement, which this publication is largely about environmentalism, a lot of the environmentalist movement, I feel, has drifted towards extremely high technology, which we'll discuss a little bit in a second what that means. But a lot of people are thinking that we are going to have a solar and wind-powered enormous electrical grid with huge battery backups to support our current standard of life. The contention of this website is that we should go in the opposite direction, that in order to have an environmentally sound society, that we should accept some compromises in our standard of living in order to help the earth and be happier, frankly, as well. The author has actually put into practice his thinking because as of June of this year, he is not supporting the regular Low Tech Magazine website anymore. He is switching completely to his solar.lowtechmagazine.com URL, which is a really interesting project in and of itself. The website is available about 95% of the time, and the reason why is because he uses a very low impact setup in order to run the solar website. He has on the Spanish apartment balcony a solar panel with I think 1 or 2 lead acid batteries for backup, and that's entirely powering his off-grid website. And so as a result, when the sun is shining, obviously, you can watch the website, you can look at the website, but also the batteries will usually keep it running overnight unless he has like several days of very little sun, in which case the website will go off. So in many cases, in many 2-week periods, it's available about 95% of the time. I have visited the website and I have to say that it is very infrequent that I'm not able to access it. And so I really appreciate that as well, that he has some beliefs about how to power a more sustainable internet and living and such like that. And he's actually putting it into practice. So he's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk. In that particular case, he has an article about it, which I will link below, discussing the embodied energy of various things like solar panels, like batteries, and like various internet infrastructure. And what he's looking at there is that to add more batteries in order to have it available 100% of the time dramatically increases the embodied energy of his setup. So by having it available 95% of the time, he probably uses half of the embodied energy, especially because batteries, and lithium batteries in particular, have so much embodied energy and require so much toxic waste, and they're not recyclable, and there's a variety of things like that. On the contrary, lead acid batteries, and I'm not sure if a lot of people are aware of this, are 100% recyclable or 99% recyclable. They're plastic, they're lead, they're acid. All of it has a well-established recycling chain. And another interesting thing that I've discovered through my own research and work, a lot of people quote a very short lifespan for lead acid batteries compared to lithium ion batteries, and a short number of discharge cycles and other downsides. Interestingly, and maybe I'll make a video about this, I have tried a technique of revitalizing lead acid batteries by overcharging them repeatedly, where you boil off the sulfation on the plates, which is commonly what causes them to no longer accept a charge or be able to power things very well, is sulfation on the plates. Essentially, you can remove that and the lead acid battery keeps working. There's not really much for it to actually go wrong inside there. All of the electrolytes can't go anywhere. The water can evaporate, but you can refill that. And the lead itself doesn't really corrode much or anything. So they're a pretty good technology. And if you're able to revitalize them at home, you can actually run them many times what they're typically quoted as doing. But anyway, it's a very cool project, but let's get into some of the interesting articles that he has. He has a variety of topics that he talks about. I think the author's name is Chris Becker, but he has a variety of topics that he talks about. He has a bunch of stuff on agriculture, which is one of the very interesting ones. After all, agriculture is one of the biggest impacts that humanity has on this earth. It's not It's not our cars. It's not our air conditioning in our houses. It is agriculture and mining that are really top of the field in human impact on the earth. But he has some interesting stuff on agriculture. He has some interesting stuff on home and heating and energy use. That stuff is quite neat. He has some stuff on cars, which are some of the fun stuff, and transportation. So I'll talk about that at the end. It's more of the fun stuff. Let's jump into agriculture. He has some interesting stuff, and I will link all the articles below. One of the articles he has is called Fruit Walls, Urban Farming of the 1600s. As many of you will know, in farming and in agriculture, the world is kind of divided into different zones, kind of telling you what you can grow. In the past, before there were a lot of greenhouses and artificial fossil fuel powered things in order to grow maybe subtropical fruits in northern climates, people had to make do with lower technology. A fruit wall is a form of very low-tech solar power, really. It's to build like a stone heavy mason wall facing south, and then to grow your kind of more temperate climate crops behind on the south side of the wall, such that they receive a lot of sun, and the stones build up heat to keep the soil warm enough. So grapes, as we know, I think originally they were grown a lot around the Mediterranean. That's where you have all the wine and stuff. But in England, they wanted to go grow grapes, and so they used these fruit walls in the 16 to 1800s to grow grapes facing south, and they're able to grow them there, which is really amazing. You can think of, at the time, a country like England was, is fairly cold in a lot of places and probably had limited fruits they had available to them. And so, especially before refrigeration, being able to ship them this distance, they want to eat them. Let's find a way to grow them. And so this is a great way to do it. That really makes me think here, especially in Canada, that I wonder if, you could grow certain things facing south if you have enough thermal mass behind it to help keep the sun in. Of course, it gets too cold here for a lot of things, but there are more techniques for growing in even colder climates. This one comes from the Soviet Union, which is known for some of its interesting technological things that they use sometimes, some of which were a little bit wasteful. But fruit trenches, cultivating subtropical plants at freezing temperatures, is an interesting article he has about that. And just to go over it very briefly, once again, citrus fruits typically require their plants require very warm and particular types of climates, like California and Florida and stuff. And in the old world, I'm sure they require nice climates as well. But in the Soviet Union, once again, similar problem. They want to have citrus fruits. It's vitamin C. It's very healthy for you and necessary for you. And so ordinarily, they would need to import it, and maybe that costs a lot. So what they tried doing, their scientists, was trying to find ways to grow citrus fruits in the northerly climates of the Soviet Union. And they were successively, with more techniques, able to grow a little bit further north, even as far as Ukraine, as far as I'm aware, southern Ukraine, which gets quite cold, comparable maybe to Saskatchewan, although where we are, it's another step colder than southern Ukraine where we were growing. So even this wouldn't work here, but if you were in a slightly warmer climate than here, maybe some parts of Alberta, you could probably get away with it. But these fruit trenches, once again, a very similar concept. They dig a trench, I think maybe it was 4 to 6 feet deep into the ground, a giant trench that runs east-west, and you plant, I think they kind of made dwarf citrus plants, like dwarf orange plants, planted in there. And so by being completely surrounded by the soil, they kind of exist in a little thermal local environment where the wind and stuff and the cold weather is less easily able to get in there. This did require a lot of manual labor, though, because they had to cover it up at night and such so that the heat is retained in there. Of course, cold air wants to travel down and hot air wants to escape. It's very similar to the fruit walls, though, in that the one side of the soil that's facing south will get constant sun during the day and warm up, kind of powering a bit of a thermal battery. And this actually worked. This is actually how I believe that the Soviets actually employed this on a fairly large scale. It wasn't all in climates as northerly as Ukraine. A lot of it was in some of their more southern possessions, like maybe Georgia and those places. But this did work. This was real, and it allowed growing citrus plants in far more northerly climates than was ordinarily possible. And you can see, especially before refrigeration, before trucking, this really would have had some big benefits. The website also has some interesting articles on the poop business, which is something that I feel very strongly about, interestingly, especially after reading some of his articles. And I can't quite remember the name of his articles right now. But essentially, in farming, a consistent problem that comes up is that we are taking out nutrients from the soil, and none of it is going back in. We can replace nutrients that are achieved through mining and such. Like here in Saskatchewan, we have a big potash industry. So the potassium that you take out of the soil, you can put that back in the form of rocks of potassium. The nitrogen that we can take out, we can put that back in the form of ammonia. But I believe there are about 12 to 16 essential plant nutrients. I don't remember exactly, but there's many of those that we aren't putting back. And so as a result, year after year, you are taking more and more and more nutrients out of the soil. And what this does is it kind of kills the topsoil and leads to lower and lower yields, especially in a lot of the air. Well, here's another thing too. Let's face it. Farmland, there is some better farmland than other areas. A lot of the wetter areas are probably better farmland, whereas here on the plains, we have thin topsoil in the first place. It tends to be dry on the plains. It tends to be very windy. A lot of things that don't lead to that don't make it easy for plant life to live. And plant life is what builds topsoil on top of the rock that is the earth, builds up carbon in the upper layers. And so on the plains, especially after 100 years ago when people started to farm it very successfully, the topsoil became dried out and dead and blew away and caused the Dust Bowl. And we are still kind of facing that. We are amending the soil with nitrogen and potassium, which are some of the minerals that some of the elements that plants need a lot of, but all the other stuff is not being put back in. The iron, the whatever. There's lots of things in there. Zinc, I think they need some of. So, and another interesting thing as well, I don't want to go into too many asides because we'll save this for another episode, but this also changes the nutrition profile of what we're eating. I believe I've heard that, say a squash or a pumpkin that you ate 100 years ago had substantially higher nutrients than one you would eat today. And that's because just the soil is so depleted after year. So the poop business is that we are all pooping out our food and flushing it down the toilet, which goes into waste disposal and is not brought back to the farmland. All of the minerals that we took out of the soil, they eventually leave us through our poop and through our bodies. And I know it's gross, but the truth is that we really should be putting that back in the farmland soil. And there's ways to do that safely so that we don't transmit bacterial diseases back to humans. There's certainly ways to do that safely, but this is not a radical idea. This is what all civilizations have done for all of history. We just stopped doing it, especially because we found these convenient mining sources of nitrogen and potassium and such. But this is what all societies do. Very notably, Chinese society, and he has some examples in these articles, and I'll link it below. But there were people that went around the town and collected all the dung from horses, from humans, containing all the important things that are necessary for plant life that they took out of the soil, and they put it back on the soil. And more or less, this essentially means that you can keep farming the soil forever. There's not really a big leak of minerals in that system, as long as you're getting most of the poop back onto the soil. And what that means is that you can continue to keep your topsoil healthy, you can even increase your topsoil, and not only reverse processes like desertification and Dust Bowl things, but it actually does the opposite. It keeps building the topsoil out. I really believe that in a lot of the areas of the world that we see that are dry now, a lot of them used to have big human civilizations, or deforested, a lot of them used to have big human civilizations. And what tended to happen is that people naturally, cut down all the trees and they didn't replant them, and they farmed a lot on certain areas, but maybe didn't amend the soil enough. And so when there's no plants in the soil for the root system to keep it together, the topsoil starts to blow away, and essentially all you're left with is rocks and sand, which is the inorganic parts of the soil. But it's very promising, though, that if we change some of our methods of agriculture, this is completely reversible. It might take 100 years or 200 years to increase the organics in some of these areas, but it's places like Nevada and like Egypt and stuff. They could become green again. It's definitely not impossible, but we would need to change how we're doing things. So this is a very interesting thing, and I'll link some of those articles below about the poop and such. Let's skip on to another topic about the household. So some of these are very interesting as well, because they're not only very applicable to environmentalism, but they're also very applicable to saving money and how to lead your own life. One of the really interesting couple of articles he has is about homes and how to heat yourself and not the space. Here in Canada, for many of us, one of the largest expenses that we will have is home heating, and especially because the winters here are so long and so cold. The contention of a lot of environmentalists and people in that sector and politicians and such is that we're going to modify our entire housing stock to use higher efficiency windows to increase their insulation, maybe knock down existing buildings and rebuild better buildings. But when you actually look at the numbers, this is going to be an unbelievable amount of money and will likely take decades in order to actually do this to the entire housing stock, in order to save the amount of energy that we've signed on to with the Paris Climate Accords and such. The contention of this author, and he backs it up with a lot of very sound science, is that we should instead be heating ourselves rather than the home. Heating an entire home requires, especially with the type of heating system that we use, which is central air, requires heating up an enormous volume of air, of course, which takes a lot of energy to heat each cubic foot, burning a lot of gas or using a lot of electricity to do that, and then blowing it around the house. And obviously, I can see in my own life, this is extremely wasteful. For one thing, there's many rooms that I am not currently sitting in. Heating them far above freezing point is not very helpful, is not currently helping me to stay warm. And moreover, the room that I'm currently sitting in, it looks like it's about maybe 30 feet long by 12 feet deep or something. The only heat that I am feeling right now is the air that is directly surrounding me. The rest of the air that I'm not touching, it wouldn't matter if it were cold or hot. I'm not touching it, so I wouldn't feel it. Of course, there'd be convection, but nonetheless, we're heating a lot of air that we are not actually using. So the article has a couple of interesting ideas about how to actually heat what we want to heat, which is ourselves. So he mentioned a couple, which is one is resistive heating up against our body, and the other one is using like a heat lamp. I forget what they call that type. It's just slipping off my mind right now. But let's start with just heating ourselves. There's a lot of neat ways to do that. A common one is an electric blanket, although they're getting less common, but it's really a great idea. The amount of electricity that you use to heat an electric blanket is so minuscule compared to what it takes to heat a room, say, in terms of the amount of energy. And yet an electric blanket often leaves you feeling like, wow, I'm like too hot. This is like really, really warm behind me. Whereas you just the air in a room, it's like this is not particularly warm or anything. So it's a very efficient way to heat up your body. Many people will have seen my YouTube video on my Milwaukee heated jacket, and that thing is pretty amazing. Once again, in a lot of situations, like this is too hot, like this is very warm, and you can turn it down. But that thing is powered by a tiny lithium-ion battery, and it puts out a lot of heat. And the reason why is because it's right up against my skin. And especially if you put another layer over it, you're not wasting as much heat to the outside. And so it is a super efficient way to do it. And I think that you can buy many types of products like that where they're just powered by a little plug or something, or a battery maybe, and they heat up various parts of your body. And yeah, that's an excellent way to do it. Another interesting way is these pointy heat lamps. I am really forgetting the name of those. I do know it, but I have one for my garage, and they're often used in like open air spaces where they need to heat people, like train stations or something. But it's really a great technology because, once again, with very little electricity, you can feel quite warm because it's pointing it all at you. It's basically a heating element or a heating light bulb that has a series of mirrors around it to either point it conically or along an axis, like axially. And with this, you can point all of the heating energy of that bulb straight at you or straight at a certain area. Maybe if you have like a living room or something, maybe you could point it at your couch, for example, because like, oh, I'll be sitting there and that's where I lounge, and so that it'll be warm already. Whereas if I'm walking around, maybe I'm moving a bit and I don't need to be as warm. But that's a really great option. I've used those and they can feel very warm, especially because certain, like the garage that we have that's not heated, the reason I have it in there is because it would take an absurd amount of electricity to heat it up to a few degrees, and it probably wouldn't be able to get very warm because it's not insulated, and so you'd reject too much heat to the environment, so you wouldn't be able to get it warm using electric heat. But this thing on the side that is pointing towards the lamp, you actually feel quite warm, especially if you're close to it. The downside to these type of lamps is that typically your one side feels very warm, but the other side doesn't. I think that something like heating like a couch or something is a great way to do that, because if you just have it on pointing at your couch, it would warm up the couch. And then when you sit on it, the couch would feel warm, and then your front would also feel warm because the lamp is still pointing at it. And I actually have another example of using a heat lamp in our house here. My son James, we have our room in the basement here, and so it's often cool down here because, once again, in a central heating system, all the hot air goes to the ceiling anyway, so your floor is really cold, and the basement is really cold compared to the upstairs, and that's really cold compared to the top floor. So I really hate central heating. It's like a very, very bad and uncomfortable way to heat a house, and super inconsistent depending on where you are. But anyway, my son James, we have a little change table for him here in the basement. It's always cold. It doesn't matter, if the heat is like okay-ish in the house, the table is always cold. And we have to take his clothes off in order to change his diaper. So at night, when we want to just change his diaper and go back to sleep, we would put him on there and he starts crying because it's so cold on his back, right? And he was born very skinny, so he was like, it's too cold for him. So we thought about like maybe an electric blanket or something, but he's sometimes covered in poop or something down there, so we don't want to get that all over an electric blanket. So once again, looking at technology, at simple technologies, came up with a solution. Let me put a heat lamp above him. It's like a chicken bulb that they use for heating like chicken coops. They're very affordable. And just suspend it straight above where he's going to be sitting, turn it on for a few minutes so it heats up the pad, and then put him on and change him. And he does not cry on that table anymore. And as a matter of fact, he loves it. It's a little bit, I used to have it where it had two settings, like a low setting and a high setting, but I kind of put it a little bit higher than it should be. So the high setting is the only useful one. But he absolutely loves it on that table, especially when we take his clothes off and his tummy can get some sun. You put your hand on his tummy after a while and it's like very warm to the touch. He's safe on there. He's totally safe, but he really likes it. He kind of just splays out and just tans on there for a while. And it's also kind of a reddish light, so it doesn't wake him up too much. It doesn't activate the daylight sensors in your head. So I quite enjoy that, and I would highly recommend that. As a matter of fact, I might make a video about that for other parents, because I'm sure people have faced the issue of changing tables being cold and babies crying on them. This is a good solution for that. So anyway, yeah, I really like that one. Another article that the website had on a similar topic was the revenge of the hot water bottle. So we've been talking about a lot of electrical methods of heating up till now. I want to talk about one that is an even simpler technology. Once again, we're all about low technology here. He talked about the revenge of the hot water bottle, which is a technology that is extremely simple and has been used for a very long time in many cultures, and is more popular in some poorer cultures, like Asia and stuff, where they don't heat up their houses nearly so much. We bought a couple. I found the article so interesting, and I bought a couple of hot water bottles, and they are very affordable. And it really is a great way to heat up a space that that you'll be in. Similar thing like a couch or something. We usually have a blanket on our couch. You can heat up the hot water bottles and throw them under the blanket, and then it's like having a little extra heat in there, which is nice, or your bed. So it is a great way to do that. If you don't want to waste so much water every time you have to dump it out, you could buy like an electric hot water heater, and pour water into that and just reuse it or something, or you could dump it in your toilet tank. So there's a variety of things you could do there. But the nice thing about hot water is that theoretically you can heat it using whatever a wood fire or something. So it holds the potential to be an extremely low technology, basically, which is quite nice. Now, a lot of people will ask. A lot of people naturally think, as would I, some of these technologies like, well, we can't just heat ourselves, right? We need to heat our space partially so that water in our pipes doesn't freeze. And that's exactly a great synergy that it has with this idea. So I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but the hotter that you heat your house, the amount of heat that you're wasting becomes extremely disproportionately high. And the reason why is because of R value, the resistive value of the insulation in your walls. The greater the temperature differential between the outside and the inside, the more heat you lose, obviously, but it's a disproportionately high amount of heat that you lose. And he has this example that if you heat your house to, I think he listed in this study like 23 degrees or 22 degrees, pretty normal temperature, you lose a certain amount of heat. But if you lower the temperature in your house to 16 degrees, you lose a certain amount of heat. And the difference there can be 35 to 50% increased heating costs for just a few degrees difference. And that would become even more notable the colder it is outside. Here in Canada, once again, we deal with extremely cold winters. And I'm really eager, if we get a house at some point, to test this out myself. Like, is it actually a better idea to cool the house down and just heat ourselves with, like, wearing a bit more clothes and maybe using some electric heating and heating the spaces that we like to sit down? It might be a really good option, especially because, costs are raising for a lot of people. And this is a really simple thing. It's not expensive to get. As a matter of fact, the Milwaukee heated jacket is kind of luxurious, but they sell like a heated hoodie as well. And it's quite a bit cheaper. And I would actually recommend it because you can wear it under other things, which is the more efficient way to keep the heat in. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of ways here you can save money and lower your energy bill and lower your impact on the world if you're concerned about that. But it's just some really interesting science. It's based on some very well-studied stuff like R values and that sort of thing. But yeah, you should keep your house above 0 degrees so the pipes don't freeze. But you could keep it a bit lower and try to heat up the spaces that you're actually using or heat up yourself. All right, so that's been an interesting set of stuff. But let's talk a little bit more about transportation, which is the really fun stuff. I like this a lot. And as you guys know, I'm quite into cars. I'm quite into airplanes. I'm not as into bikes. He has some great articles on bikes, but maybe somebody who's more into bikes could approach that. But the first article that I want to talk about is his article about the Citroën 2CV, or Citroën 2 Chevaux. This is a very interesting, famous French car from I think it's from the 50s. It might be from the 40s. It's quite old. But it has a tiny 370cc engine, like a motorcycle, basically. They were very famous for being designed for the French farmer to take his chickens to market. And it was designed so that if you put eggs in the passenger seat driving over a heaving, muddy road, that you wouldn't break any of the eggs on your way to the market. So it's quite an ingenious little design, one of those famous European small cars from after the war. But what's very funny, though, is that the Citroën 2CV gets insane fuel economy. I think that he quoted it as it gets 66 miles per gallon. My dad owns an extremely fuel-efficient car. He owns a 1990 Volkswagen diesel car. And he very proudly gets well above 50 miles per gallon out of a 35-year-old car, which is impressive. But the 2CV is far older than that and trounces it by quite a large margin, getting 66 miles per gallon, which is very impressive. Now, the interesting thing is that Citroën's current subcompact car, the C1, as of the time of that writing, got 60 miles per gallon or something like that. So it got quite comparable miles per gallon despite that much evolution. Now, the interesting thing is that the C1, it can travel a lot faster. It has a lot more safety features. It probably weighs about twice as much as the 2CV. So there is a lot of technology that came in to make that get as good a fuel economy as it does, despite being heavier and going faster and being more comfortable, and presumably using a lot more electricity as well on its radio and entertainment system and lights. But nonetheless, it's reason to pause for pause and think about it. It's like we have a lot more technology here, but there's a very low technology way to achieve very good miles per gallon, which is just to make a simple light car. And once again, it's not as comfortable, it's not as fast, but how comfortable do you need to be, and how fast do you need to go, sort of thing. I think one of the things about cars like this is that cars in the past actually used to be quite light in a lot of cases. A lot of what has increased the weight is safety equipment, and I totally understand that people want to be safe. In my opinion, a big issue with safety with cars is that we have little tiny cars driving next to giant trucks, and not just pickup trucks, but semi-trucks. When you drive around in Saskatoon here, there are enormous amounts of semi-trucks all over the street, and those things will completely annihilate your car if they actually collide with you. They're unbelievably heavy, and it's quite dangerous in my opinion. And frankly, I don't know why we need this many trucks. We have a train network for doing this sort of thing, and you can use smaller trucks to then transport from the trains. But whatever, I think that trains are kind of, even though they're such an efficient technology, there isn't the will there to use them again. And so we're just defaulting to semi-trucks, which are, less efficient than trains and stuff, but they can travel more places, I suppose. If we made a more reasonable situation of the roads and got most of the semi-trucks off the road and transported that stuff by rail, of course they'd have to make new rails and to more places, but we should do that, I think. But then cars wouldn't need to have as much safety equipment, because you would only be colliding with another light car, which would radically reduce the amount of damage that your car would have. People a lot of times look at my older cars and they say, wow, that thing must be so heavy and so inefficient and so unsafe and such. But the interesting thing, and a lot of times the people that are saying this, they grew up during the 80s and 90s when cars were a lot smaller than my large American cars from the 60s and 70s. But the opposite has started to happen in recent years, where cars once again are getting extremely large and extremely heavy, especially if you include pickup trucks, because pickup trucks are being driven as cars by many people. Here in Saskatchewan, half of the vehicles are pickup trucks, and people are not hauling anything in them. It's just a car, basically. It's just a big luxury car. And those pickup trucks, they weigh as much or more than my large car that can seat 6 people. The Tesla Model S is like a very popular car, and it weighs, I think, 5,000 pounds. My 1980 Chrysler Newport, it weighs 3,800 pounds. It weighs substantially less, half a ton less at least, than the Tesla Model S, and is about as large. Yet people don't make fun of the Tesla Model S as being an enormous, wasteful land yacht. And that's not to get into SUVs. A lot of Toyota and Nissan SUVs, their fuel economy is the same as my car, and people would say, your car must be so inefficient. But my car actually has more seats than a lot of those pickup trucks. If those pickup trucks have 5 seats, my car can carry 6 adults. And we have carried 6 adults in it. And so, I think it's important to keep things in perspective, that cars from the past were not stupid. The people designing them weren't crazy and unsafe and stuff. They were designing with the technology they had at the time, and they did some impressive things. And despite all of our increased technology now, in many cases, when you compare things in terms of how do I actually use this and what does it do, modern cars don't stack up that amazingly better than those older cars, despite all the increased technology. Anyway, that is an aside. The Citroen 2CV article, interesting. He has a similar one with electric cars. Many of you will know that electric cars were very popular around the turn of the century in the 1900s because they are frankly a lower technology than gasoline cars. They are much simpler and have much fewer moving parts. And that's a good reason why they actually should have a place in the world. I don't think they should be forced on people by the government or anything like that. But I think that they could form a great niche of city cars, because cars are frequently very inefficient as their engine is warming up. And electric cars, their engine doesn't need to warm up. So it's a great option if you need to travel a short distance or have a second vehicle, I think. Electric cars being very popular around the turn of the century was because they were simpler, and gasoline cars required a lot more maintenance and knowledge on the part of the driver. The interesting thing is that many electric cars now have been able to reach the 100-mile range number as a big number. And they're doing that with all their modern lithium-ion batteries, their inverter motors, all sorts of amazing things. So what would we guess that cars from 100 years ago, that their electric range was? It was 100 miles. Unbelievable. 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, they had the same range as modern electric cars. How could that possibly be? They they only had lead acid batteries and DC electric systems with big honking motors, and yet they had the same range as modern cars. Now granted, there are some luxury electric cars now that get higher range than that, but many that are reasonable to buy still have about 100-mile range. And I think that's a good number for a city car, to be honest with you. I don't think you need more than that. But once again, the caveat is similar to the Citroen 2CV with these older cars. They traveled a lot slower. They were much lighter. They weren't as comfortable, I suppose, in sense. Although I will say that some of these cars look pretty fancy. They have nice velour seats inside and upright cabins that you can wear your top hat in. His point here, once again, is that much of the increase in range and power capacity is just being absorbed by creature comforts and stuff that is arguably unnecessary. Once again, in a city car, do you really need to be able to go 160 kilometers an hour, 100 miles an hour? No, you don't, because that's completely illegal and unnecessary. So these cars in the past, once again, these electric cars and the 2CV, they are, even though they're maybe not exactly low technology, but they are entirely mechanical or electromechanical in the case of the electric car. They're impressively simple. Many people threw away these old cars thinking these things are junk, but they are so absurdly simple that it is kind of insane. Some of these, the Citroen 2CV, I can almost guarantee, I haven't looked at the car that closely, I can almost guarantee that it is entirely mechanical, every piece of it. Ironically enough, the electrical part of the car, the ignition, is extremely likely entirely mechanical, being run by a breaker point on a spring that taps closed in order to run the spark, and a distributor with a little spinning electrode that directs it to which cylinder to run. The electric cars of the past, those type as well, once again, ironically enough, even though they're electric, what is happening inside them is entirely mechanical. There is electromechanical, I suppose you could say. There are ionized particles inside the battery moving towards the other pole that's creating the electric field through the circuitry. You're very likely running a form of variable resistor in order to direct the electricity going to the wheels. There's the motor that just has its pair of bearings, and the field is turning the giant rotor and stuff like that. Very, very simple pieces of machinery. The type of thing, even though they might seem complicated if you're not familiar with it, is the type of thing that you could rebuild parts for in any part of the world using a machine shop. These are the type of machines, something like the 2CV, I could certainly say, and probably these old electric cars, that the type of things that if 100 people were left on some island with no help, within a couple of decades, it's quite possible, if they had a source of iron and a source of some of these materials, that they could actually build enough of a society to make something like this. We cannot say that for anything that is computer controlled. In order to build a semiconductor industry, 100 people left on an island would probably not be able to do it. It would probably take them more like 100 years and require a lot of intervening technologies to be designed. But these are interesting articles nonetheless. Let's take a look at some of the. Well, actually, let's go back to this topic. He has another interesting article, which is commercial airliners from the 1950s were as efficient as modern airliners. This is a pretty stunning thing to hear, but it's very similar to the electric car 2CV articles in a sense. There is a study that he pointed to that claims that commercial airliners have become substantially more efficient over the last several decades, but that study omits the commercial airliners from the immediate post-war period, the 1940s and 50s. And these aircraft were the most advanced piston-engined aircraft that were ever built in human history. They were some of the last of that technology which had powered aircraft since the beginning of its inception up until that point, and they were quite advanced. But their fuel efficiency was surprisingly good, and the reason why is because similarly, advances in technology were absorbed by increasing speed and comfort. The jet engine that modern aircraft use essentially work by burning their fuel inside of a high pressure environment and then ejecting the exhaust, which is still expanding, out the back in order to produce thrust. Now, if you simply burn jet fuel in an open pit, you will produce no useful work from it because all of its expansion is just going out into the atmosphere. So the key in order to get fuel efficiency in a situation like that is to generate useful work from the expansion of the gases. The first types of jet engines simply compressed the gas and exhausted it out the back to produce forward thrust, and this was fairly inefficient. Although they did recover part of the energy in order to run their high pressure compressor. An interesting fact about jet engines, not to get into too many asides, is that they use many multiples of the power that they produce in order to run their compressors. Say if a jet engine produced something like 100 horsepower output, it is using something like 200 or 300 horsepower in order to compress the gases to produce that. So it's actually producing, 400 horsepower, let's say, with 100 horsepower of useful work. This is why they're quite an advanced technology, is that they need to be extremely strong in order to produce a usable amount of work. But anyway, aside from that, the earliest turbojets were supplanted by a more advanced technology called the turbofan. The turbofan adds another turbine at the back of the engine, which is spun by the expanding exhaust gases. That turbine runs to the front of the engine to run a giant fan that is ducted. This is the type of commercial airliner that many people would have seen with those big pod engines. So theoretically, the larger you can make that, the more air you can move using that front fan that is ducted from the exhaust gases, the more efficient you can make the engine, because it is still burning the same amount of fuel, but moving more air. And it's moving that air closer to the speed of the ambient air, which makes it more efficient. So the big struggle in turbofans has been how to make larger fans to extract more usable work from the same core, they call it, which is just the internal turbojet. There is another step of engines that is even more efficient and able to extract more work, and it is called the turboprop. It looks more like an old aircraft engine. It has a giant propeller at the front, and similarly, these use a fan at the back that runs to the front, sometimes through a gearbox, in order to run that fan. These type of engines typically extract 90 to 95% of the expanding gas's energy and use it to turn the fan, meaning that they derive minimal thrust from the air coming out of the core of the engine. This is typically very efficient. A big issue with these engines and why they're not used on all aircraft is that the large blades of a turboprop, they typically begin to exceed the speed of sound as at their tips because they're so large. And so traveling faster and faster in a turboprop makes them generally unacceptably noisy for a commercial aircraft. So that is a big deal and is why they're not used on larger aircraft. Another thing I will note as well is that larger aircraft tend to be more efficient based on square cube laws, I believe. And as a result, being more efficient, they tend to travel faster with less penalty for their drag. And so as a result, pretty much all large aircraft use turbofan engines because a turboprop traveling that fast would be too loud. Smaller aircraft are able to take advantage of the turboprop's high efficiency. But there is an even more efficient technology than any of these, as it turns out, which is the piston engine like we use in our cars. I think that an issue with turbine engines probably in general is that they are getting very hot, and a lot of the heat is likely just making its way out through various components and escaping. But furthermore, you're always losing a substantial amount of heat and expansion out the back of the engine. Propeller aircraft, they actually completely enclose the detonation and expansion of the gases inside of a cylinder. Until you open the valves, it is totally trapped in there, and the only way for it to expand is to push the pistons down. So you're able to extract a lot of work out of that. And furthermore, a lot of these aircraft that he's talking about from the 1950s, like the Lockheed Constellation, probably the Douglas DC-6, I believe they all use some form of turbo supercharger or turbochargers, which is an even more useful work generated from the expanding exhaust gases. Normally in a car engine that's not turbocharged, or any piston engine, when the exhaust valve opens, the remaining hot exhaust gases simply expand out of the engine and do not generate work. When you use a turbocharger, The expanding exhaust gases that are coming out of the engine then meet the turbine impeller or whatever of the turbocharger, and they push more fresh air into the engine. This increases the efficiency because that expanding exhaust gases is turned into work. That work is pushing air into the engine. Otherwise, the engine has to actually pump that air in if there were no turbocharger, which requires work from the engine. So it is recovering some of the heat energy being used to produce useful work, to get more air into the engine and reduce the pumping losses. And that's a big reason why a lot of highly efficient cars now are almost universally using turbochargers, is because they're not just for making more power, they do genuinely increase the fuel efficiency of cars by taking more useful work out of the engine. So it's an interesting article. I'll link it below, obviously, but it's the type of thing that is very interesting and very tantalizing. Maybe there is a future for piston-powered aircraft. And this is not just this one environmentalist guy talking about this. There have been several attempts to get piston engines back into aircraft because they are more efficient, and that is known. There was actually an interesting project by the Canadian engine builder, very famous for producing the Avro Arrows engine. It's called Orenda Engines, and they had a project in the 80s to take a Chevrolet 454 big block car engine, which is normally a very big, heavy cast iron muscle car and truck engine, and turn it into an aircraft engine. And there was a lot involved in that, a lot of safety things like adding dual distributors and lightening it. I think they might have changed a lot of components to aluminum as well. They made the size of the displacement of the engine larger as well to increase the power output. But that project was aimed at replacing a small General Electric turboprop that was used in a lot of aircraft. And they could see if we replace it with this modified car engine, that will increase the fuel efficiency of all these aircraft. It will use less fuel. And so there is a market there for increased fuel economy. However, I think that at that time, maybe fuel prices started to drop a lot. And so some of these projects, you lose interest at that point. A big reason why turbine engines replaced reciprocating piston engines in the first place in aircraft is that reciprocating piston engines tend to be heavier for their power output compared to turbine engines. So that is a big deal in aircraft. You always want to reduce weight wherever possible. That's a really big deal in aircraft. It increases the efficiency and performance of them to reduce weight. So a piston engine is a huge step in the wrong direction there, but they do have those inherent advantages of being more fuel efficient under given circumstances. And another big reason why too is that piston engines have a lot of moving parts, and so they're kind of inherently very unreliable. And also they reciprocate as well. They have a lot of moving parts, and so that makes them inherently unreliable. Typically in piston engine aircraft engines, you'll see a lot of duplicate things like duplicate ignition systems and things like that. And that's because people know that these things can have something come loose and then they just kind of break apart. That's not a big issue on the ground, but in the air, you don't want to have an engine failure. It can be very dangerous. So turbine engines, they have very few moving parts, and they have better maintenance intervals and such. And they're just a spinning component, which tends to have less wear and stuff. So they're really quite a good option for high power output and simplicity. And that's why they would probably replace piston engines in the first place. But if we are really looking for some situations in which we need high fuel economy, the piston engine might end up coming back. A lot of the research now is into aerospace diesels. Diesels are even heavier than gasoline engines, so that is an even bigger uphill battle, but they are, once again, more thermally efficient than gasoline engines for a variety of reasons. Let's end the podcast on a couple of fun, goofy ideas that are probably not about to come back, but are fun nonetheless and interesting to talk about. A couple of these projects I would personally love to try out myself, especially if the channel gets a little bit larger and we have a bit more funding. I will definitely look into doing these because with a bit more of a budget, we can do some more fun stuff like that. The first one is wood gas powered vehicles. This one not everyone might be familiar with, but wood gas is a fuel that you can produce from the thermal decomposition of wood. More or less, and it used to be quite common, especially before natural gas networks were common in the US. Broadly speaking, it's called producer gas. Usually it's made of wood or coal. And these carbonaceous fuels, you can in an environment without oxygen, you can heat them up and they will produce a gas that can be burned. Obviously, if you heat them up with air, they will themselves burn, and that's still burning wood gas, but then you can't collect it. So they, for example, make kind of a tank that looks like a hot water heater, set a fire underneath it, and you'll get this kind of smoky stuff coming out, and that is wood gas. It is mostly inert. It is mostly carbon dioxide, and so as a result, it is not a very energy-dense fuel, and the rest of it is stuff like, I believe, methane and carbon monoxide, so not extremely energy-dense fuels that are the flammable part of it. So wood gas is, when it was used in cars, it was generally not tanked because you cannot tank a lot of fuel with it. Generally what they were doing was they're actually producing the gas as they drive. They would actually have a giant thing that looks like a hot water heater or a boiler on the front or back of the car and light a fire underneath it, fill this tank full of wood and light a fire underneath it, and you'd have to take that 1,000-degree gas, cool it through a radiator at the front, and then it can go into the gasoline engine. The big advantage with this technology, though, is that the gasoline engine itself doesn't really require hardly any modification. Wood gas burns very similarly to gasoline or propane or other types of fuels that work well in gasoline engines. The big difference is you would need to design a mixer that is able to get enough of the fuel gas in relative to air, because once again, most of the gas is inert, and the remaining gas that is actually flammable is not very energy dense. So you need to have a lot of fuel gas enter the engine compared to air relative to something like gasoline, which is usually, I think, 15-1 or something is the stoichiometric ratio. It's probably closer to 1-3 or something for producer gas, although I'm not too sure. These vehicles were used a lot during the Second World War, especially in forested European countries like the Scandinavian countries, France and such. The author has some really interesting pictures and numbers about how many of these things were used during the war. A lot of them were buses, as personal vehicles became hard to get in the first place during the war, but buses still needed to run to get people to their jobs and to places, and gasoline was rationed or unavailable throughout the Second World War in many places. So producer gas or wood gas became a really good option, actually, especially given that it is a local technology that can be simply fueled with local wood, dried out, and then put inside the vehicle. Buses also probably lent themselves to this because they have large, solid frames and don't need to travel very fast with these giant things attached to them. But it is a cool technology. I would love to try it out if we get a little bit more funding for the channel. And it is a very low-tech solution that is quite sustainable. You do not need to rely on large global multinational oil companies in order to fuel your car on wood gas or producer gas. There is actually a guy in Saskatchewan who was featured on CBC News a few years ago, and he turned his pickup truck into a wood gas powered vehicle. And it was very neat. It doesn't seem like a great idea in Saskatchewan to me because there isn't a lot of wood here. It's not very forested until you get to the north of the province, but nonetheless an interesting technology. I would highly recommend checking this one out to see the photos and all the stories and stuff. It is quite cool and shows the ingenuity of people in times of war and great difficulty. A similar off-the-wall idea that is not likely to take off is gas bag vehicles. This is not necessarily different than wood gas vehicles, but it is a way of fueling cars on very low energy density fuels in a low technology way. Principally methane. Methane is a gas that is a single carbon atom mixed with a hydrogen atom, and it is a flammable gas. Many people will be also familiar with propane, which conversely is 3 carbon atoms mixed with hydrogens that balance out that equation. And the ideal form of gasoline is a form of octane, which has 8 carbons. So you can see as you make higher carbon chained fuels, you get higher energy density, and they become more liquidy or eventually solids in the form of waxes. A big issue with methane is that because it is so gaseous and low energy density, it is very difficult to pack enough of it into a space in order to burn it. Due to methane's low energy density and desire to stay a gas, it is very difficult to pack enough of it into a mobile application in order to be useful. It is, however, conversely a very cheap fuel because it is probably the most common hydrocarbon on Earth, being that it has the lowest number of carbons. any other type of hydrocarbon, as far as I'm aware, essentially needs to be made by squeezing other methanes in the deep depths of the earth into longer chains, and that requires a lot of pressure, and there's not a really good way of doing it synthetically for us. It's a difficult thing to do. So methane is conversely quite cheap and quite available. It is often used it is often called natural gas for home heating, because you don't need to store it, you simply need to transport it, where you kind of have an unlimited supply of this low energy density fuel, but it's very cheap. So there is a technology for getting a usable amount of methane into a vehicle, and it's called CNG. But CNG is a great example of high technology. It requires very sophisticated pumps, tanks, and other such systems in order to compress a usable amount of methane into that space. And you will note that it is called compressed natural gas. I don't believe that the pressures they are able to achieve are enough even to liquefy methane, which requires even more insane amounts. So CNG vehicles have limited range, although they can be very cheap to operate because of the cost of methane. But there is an interesting low technology way to pack a usable amount of methane or wood gas or other of these low density fuels into a vehicle, and it is called the gas bag vehicle. And we actually have one on display here at the Western Development Museum in Saskatchewan. It is a very odd sight to see. It essentially looks like a blimp tied to the top of your car. But the way you do it is you build a frame about the size of the car on top of your car, and then you fashion a flexible bag that sits on top of that, and you fill the bag up, the balloon or bag up, with gas, which raises it up, and then as you want to drive, you disconnect from your feet or whatever, and the weight of the bag will pressurize the gas enough to force it into your engine where you can burn it. So it is an extremely simple technology. You probably wouldn't want to go anywhere very far or very fast with this type of gas bag. As a matter of fact, as you're driving, because of the low density of the fuel, you could probably see the bag very slowly drifting down as it pushes the gas out. But it is a neat technology. Once again, something that I would love to try. And, theoretically, if you wanted to do this, you can actually get you can get like a gas fitter to fit like a barbecue connecting gas hose that's kind of like a flexible line. You can get them to hook something like that up to to the outside of your house, so you can use it for your quote unquote barbecue. But if you want to fill up your gas bag vehicle with it, as long as no one sees, you might be okay. And so that would be an extremely low cost way of actually driving a fossil fuel vehicle. Although, maybe for that much effort, maybe you just want to make your own electric car or something. But I will link that article. It has, once again, some very funny pictures and interesting pictures of gas bag vehicles. Very simple technology, and it's probably not one that's about to come back. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to the first episode of the Kerry&Liam podcast. This has been your host, Liam, and I hope you guys will join us on the second episode. I'm not sure what the second episode is going to be yet. It might be about seasteading. It might be about any number of other things. I have a few topics that I wrote down that I want to cover. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, guys. We'll talk to you later.